Her hands were steady when everyone else's weren't. That was the thing nobody ever mentioned afterward. Not in the inquiry, not in the report, not in the meeting where they handed her the termination letter in a manila envelope like it was a parking ticket. Nurse Calloway had noticed it first, 3 months before everything unraveled. She'd watched Voss stand at the foot of Bay 7 during a full code. Crash cart arriving late, the attending shouting contradictory orders, a second patient coding 2 bays over, and Voss had just gone quiet. Not frozen, quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something was happening underneath that nobody else could see. That was Madeline Voss, 32 years old. Night shift charge nurse at Harrowfield General, a mid-sized regional hospital 40 minutes north of Ottawa. She'd grown up in Renfrew County, the youngest of three, daughter of a former RCMP officer who died when she was 19, and a mother who still kept a vegetable garden and refused to use a smartphone. Maddie had gone into nursing the way some people go into a vocation, not because it looked good on paper, but because she genuinely could not imagine doing anything else with her hands. What the hospital didn't know about her, what almost no one knew, was the 7 years before nursing school. The years she never talked about. The years that had made her hands stop shaking in the middle of chaos. She'd enrolled at 18 in the Canadian Armed Forces as a combat medical technician. 2 tours. The first in a forward operating base in a region where the air smelled like dust and diesel, and the nights were terrifyingly quiet before they weren't. The second embedded with a rapid response unit, rotating through remote field stations, where the nearest surgical facility was a helicopter ride away, and sometimes the helicopter wasn't coming. She'd done things in those years that most people who worked in a hospital would never be asked to do. She'd kept people alive with equipment that cost less than a fast food meal. She'd made decisions that no textbook covered. She'd learned what her own fear felt like and then learned how to use it instead of fight it. When she left the forces at 25, she didn't talk about it. She enrolled in the nursing program at Algonquin, graduated near the top, took her first posting at a small community hospital in Pembroke, transferred to Harrowfield 4 years later because they had a level 2 trauma bay and she wanted to stay sharp. She was good at her job. She was also, it turned out, a problem. The first incident report she filed was in October. A medication discrepancy in the oncology wing. A patient receiving a dosage that didn't match the updated chart, the kind of thing that could be explained away as an input error, but that Voss knew, from 3 similar flags over the previous 6 weeks, was not an input error. She documented it the way she documented everything, precisely, without editorializing, with timestamps. The second incident report was in November, a billing code irregularity she'd noticed by accident when covering for the ward clerk during a staffing shortage. She almost didn't mention it. It wasn't technically her domain, but the number was wrong in a way that was too consistent to be random, and she'd learned a long time ago that the things you almost don't mention are usually the things that matter most. The third report was in January. By then, Dr. Brennan, the chief of medicine, a precise and carefully pleasant man who wore bow ties and had the handshake of someone who'd practiced it, had called her into his office twice, not to investigate the reports. To discuss, as he put it, her communication style. "You have a tendency, doctor," Brennan told her, leaning back in his chair with his fingers steepled, "to frame routine administrative matters as systemic failures. It creates an adversarial atmosphere." The dosage discrepancy affected 4 patients, Voss said, "which has been reviewed and addressed. I haven't seen the review." There was a pause. The kind of pause that means the conversation has just changed into something else. "The review is internal, Nurse Voss. It's not standard practice to share internal reviews with floor staff." She didn't argue. She thanked him for his time. She walked back to the nursing station, finished her shift, drove home in the gray February dark, and sat in her kitchen for a long time thinking about the word floor staff and what it was meant to make her feel. What it actually made her feel was familiar. She'd heard that tone before, not in hospitals, but in briefings. In the way certain officers talked to medics who asked inconvenient questions after field incidents. The message was always the same underneath the different words. "You are not the kind of person whose concern is a concern." She started keeping her own records. Not to be vindictive. Not even at first because she thought something criminal was happening. It was just a habit from the field. You wrote things down because memory was unreliable and paper wasn't. And when something went sideways, you wanted to be able to reconstruct exactly what you knew and when you knew it. By March, she had a folder on her personal laptop that contained 47 pages of documentation. Incident dates, patient file numbers, billing codes, names of staff present, discrepancies between what was ordered and what was administered, between what was billed and what she could account for in the supply logs. She wasn't a forensic accountant. She couldn't say with certainty what the pattern meant. But she knew it was a pattern, because the first thing the forces had trained into her was the difference between noise and signal. This was signal. The termination meeting was on a Thursday morning in April. She was called in at 8, which was unusual because her shift didn't start until 3. Dr. Brennan was there, and the HR director, a quiet woman named Miss Okafor, who placed a box of tissues on the table before anyone sat down, a detail Voss would remember afterward as the most telling thing in the room. The tissues meant they'd anticipated tears. They hadn't anticipated her. The reason given was performance. Specifically, creating a hostile work environment, failure to operate within the established chain of communication, and this was the one that almost made her laugh, excessive documentation practices that disrupt departmental workflow. She asked for the written performance reviews that would support these claims. Ms. Okafor said those would be provided through official channels. Voss thanked them, stood up, and left. She cried in the car. Not from humiliation, though there was some of that. Mostly from something older, a kind of grief she recognized from the first time she'd lost a patient in the field and understood that the loss was real, and also that you still had to get up the next morning. The job had meant something to her. The patients had meant something. Being told that caring too carefully was the problem felt like a particular species of cruelty, but grief, she'd learned, had a shelf life if you let it. After 20 minutes in the parking garage, she wiped her face, pulled out of the lot, and started thinking about what she actually had. 47 pages of documentation, a pattern she couldn't prove but could describe, and the knowledge that whoever had engineered her termination had done so because the documentation existed, which meant they knew it existed, which meant she'd been closer to something than she'd realized. She didn't go to the media. She didn't consult a lawyer, not yet. What she did, because it was the thing she knew how to do, was get methodical. She spent 2 weeks cross-referencing the billing codes against publicly available hospital procurement data. She reached out carefully to 2 former colleagues who'd transferred out of Harrowfield in the past year, one of whom, a pharmacist named Thibodeau, mentioned almost in passing that she'd flagged a similar discrepancy before leaving and been told it was a software issue. She located the patient file numbers and, without accessing anything she wasn't entitled to access, mapped the timeline of discrepancies against the hospital's quarterly contract renewals with its primary medical supplier. It wasn't 47 pages anymore, it was closer to 90. She was sitting at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in May, eating reheated soup and reviewing a procurement invoice when her phone rang from an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. "Ms. Voss," said the voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice, measured and unhurried, with the faint trace of a Quebec accent. "My name is Major Fontaine. I'm with the Canadian Forces Health Services Group, attached to a joint investigative unit operating out of National Defense Headquarters. I'd like to speak with you in person if you're willing." Voss set down her spoon. "About what?" she said. "About Harrowfield General," said Major Fontaine, "and about the fact that you've independently reconstructed about 60% of a 2-year federal investigation without access to the classified portions." The meeting was at a government building in Ottawa, nondescript from the outside, the kind of building that could have housed anything from a dental practice to a mid-tier government procurement office. Major Fontaine was younger than Voss had expected. Mid-40s, maybe, with close-cropped hair and the kind of posture that comes from years of people watching her walk into rooms and adjusting accordingly. She was accompanied by a civilian investigator named Sergeant Delacroix, who said very little and took careful notes. Fontaine laid it out without preamble. Harrowfield General was not an isolated case. It was one of 4 hospitals in the region implicated in a procurement fraud scheme operating through a shell company that had been routing inflated invoices through a network of legitimate medical supply contracts. The scheme had been running for approximately 3 years. It had siphoned an estimated $4.8 million from public health funds. The medical supplier at the center of it had connections to a contracts officer within a federal procurement division, and the investigation had been quietly expanding for 18 months. What they hadn't expected was Voss. "You were flagging the discrepancies from the inside," Fontaine said, "before we had them. Some of your incident reports are time-stamped weeks before our own analysts identified the same transaction." "They fired me for it," Voss said. "Yes. That's actually what accelerated our timeline. When you were terminated, it created a paper trail that connected the hospital administration directly to the suppression of internal reporting, which gave us something we'd been trying to establish for 8 months. Voss was quiet for a moment. "You knew I'd been fired. We've been aware of your situation since February, and you let it happen." Fontaine didn't look away. "We couldn't intervene without compromising the investigation. I understand that's not a satisfying answer." "It's an honest one," Voss said. "I'll take honest." What followed was 3 weeks that felt like compression, the kind of intensity she recognized from deployment, where time stops moving in a normal rhythm and instead moves in pulses, each one containing more information than should fit inside it. Fontaine's team needed Voss's documentation, her methodology, her reconstruction of the billing pattern. They also, it emerged, needed something else. We have the financial picture, Fontaine told her during their third meeting. What we don't have is clinical testimony. Someone who can explain, in terms a judge and jury can understand, what the discrepancies in the medication records actually mean for patient outcomes. Someone with floor-level credibility and the clinical knowledge to articulate the harm. You want me to testify? Eventually, yes. Before that, we'd like you to consult. Voss thought about Bay 7. She thought about the patient in oncology whose file she'd flagged in October, who had subsequently been transferred to a hospital in Kingston, whose outcome she'd never learned. She thought about what floor staff was supposed to mean and what it actually meant. Tell me about the shell company, she said. She spent the next 6 weeks working alongside Fontaine's team, not in the field. She was a nurse, not an investigator, and she was clear-eyed about what she was and wasn't, but at a table with case files and a laptop and the particular skill she'd spent years developing, the ability to see a clinical situation whole, to identify the thing that didn't fit, to hold multiple data points simultaneously and feel when the pattern was wrong. The shell company was called Northvale Medical Solutions. On paper, it was a legitimate distributor of hospital consumables based in Mississauga. In practice, it was a mechanism. Invoices went in. Money came out. The invoices described real products, gloves, syringes, IV bags, but at quantities that didn't correspond to actual inventory, and at prices that had been quietly inflated over 18 months, to the point where a box of surgical gloves that should have cost $40 was being billed at $112. The contracts officer at the federal level was a man named Whitmore, mid-50s, 17 years in the public service, the kind of unremarkable professional presence that makes people look right past you. He had a secondary residence in Gatineau that he'd paid for in cash. He had a son-in-law who sat on the board of a numbered company that owned 30% of Northvale. Dr. Brennan, it turned out, had known for 14 months. He hadn't initiated the scheme, but he'd agreed to suppress the internal reports that might have surfaced it, in exchange for a financial arrangement that had been routed through a consulting agreement his private corporation had with Northvale's parent company. The morning the arrests were announced, Whitmore, Brennan, and 3 other administrators across the network. Voss was not in Ottawa. She was in Renfrew, sitting at her mother's kitchen table, eating toast and reading the news on her phone. Her mother, who knew only that Maddie had left her hospital job and had been doing some kind of government consulting work, poured coffee and did not ask questions because she was an RCMP officer's widow and understood that some things got explained when they could be explained. You look tired, her mother said. I am tired, Voss said. Are you okay? Voss put down her phone. Outside, her mother's garden was coming in, the beans starting to climb their stakes, the tomatoes still small and green, the rhubarb extravagant at the far corner of the yard. Her father had built those stakes the spring before he died. Her mother had never replaced them. Yeah, she said. I think so. The formal inquiry began in September. Voss gave testimony over 2 days, in a federal hearing room that was beige and climate-controlled and so relentlessly neutral that it felt almost aggressive. She was there as a clinical expert and as a witness to the suppression of her own incident reports. She was precise, she was calm. She answered every question the way she'd learned to answer questions in post-incident debriefs. With exactly what she knew, in the sequence she'd known it, without embellishment and without omission. The lawyer representing Brennan's interests tried, on the second day, to characterize her documentation as obsessive. The phrase he used was disproportionate vigilance, and suggested that her military background predisposed her to an adversarial interpretation of institutional authority. Voss looked at him for a moment before answering. Disproportionate vigilance is what we call it when the vigilance turns out to be correct, she said. When it turns out to be wrong, we just call it wrong. In this case, $4.8 million in public health funds and documented harm to patients suggests it wasn't wrong. The room was quiet. Major Fontaine, seated in the gallery, did not smile, but something shifted in her expression that Voss recognized. The thing that happens when someone says the exact right thing at the exact right moment without performing it. In November, Harrowfield General's board issued a formal apology for the termination of Madeleine Voss and offered reinstatement at the charge nurse level. She took 3 days to respond. When she did, she declined reinstatement, not out of bitterness, she was careful to say in her written reply, but because she'd been offered a position with a federal patient safety advisory body that used her particular combination of clinical and analytical experience in a way she thought would create more lasting change than returning to a floor that was still in many respects rebuilding its own credibility. The letter from the Minister of Health came in December. It was brief and formal and mentioned in its second paragraph that the pattern of early flagging Voss had demonstrated Identifying systemic irregularities before they surfaced through official channels was exactly the kind of capacity the healthcare system needed more of, and that her willingness to persist in the face of institutional pressure had directly protected patient welfare at a scale that wouldn't be fully measurable for years. She kept the letter, not framed, not displayed anywhere, in the same folder where she'd kept the termination notice, because she thought it was important to remember that both things were true. The system had failed her, and the system had, eventually, been corrected. Holding only one of those facts felt like a form of dishonesty she couldn't afford. The last thing she did before the new year was find out what had happened to the oncology patient whose file she'd flagged in October, the first report, the one that had started everything. It took some time and the cooperation of a colleague at Kingston General, but she eventually learned that the patient, a retired schoolteacher from Petawawa, had been stabilized and was responding to a corrected treatment protocol. She was alive. Voss sat with that for a while. She didn't tell anyone about it immediately. It felt like something that belonged to her privately, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the actual unit of measurement. Not the $4.8 million, not the federal inquiry, not the apology letter. One patient, alive, because someone had noticed a number that was wrong and written it down and refused when it cost them to pretend they hadn't seen it. Her hands were still steady, they always had been. That was the thing nobody ever mentioned. Not at the beginning and not at the end. She'd never needed anyone to notice. She just needed the work to matter, and now, for the first time in a long time, she was certain that it had.